There's a second part to the Civil War. Oversimplified has made one more. Are you ready for this? America is going to war with itself. I wrote a little song for Oversimplified. Today we watch part 2. Before we start, here are the new patrons who have lifted themselves to the level of the gods. Ashley Pieretti, I'm pretty sure you are Italian. All of them actually are from America. I'm trying to say the names as they, seem to me. Pieretti is pretty much Italiano. Tristan Petz. Matthew S. Russell. Oh, you got the S in between, like Ulysses S. Grant. Matthew Unconditional Surrender Russell, that's you. Jacob Vanemuise. That is definitely not pronounced like that. Jacob Vanemuise. Sorry. John Pepple, but it's John like without an H, it's Jon or Juan Peple. I don't know, maybe you're Mexican, I don't know. Oh, who knows how to say these names. All I want to say is I'm incredibly thankful for all of you for becoming a patron. There's one more. Riley McMahon. Hello Riley, you from Scotland, right? You got a Mac in your name. That's the most horrible depiction of a Scottish accent I can do. At least I'm trying to be true to your cultures. Cheerio mates, thank you for becoming a patron. Let's jump into the war.
As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights.
I always view Kentucky nowadays as this southern state. They have the fried chicken and I'm from Kentucky, I got fried chicken. I always view them as the southern state of accents and like Texas but without weapons, like, Kentucky, South. But here they are from the Union.
After the war, along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond.
Okay, I know, yeah, McClellan, that's the dude for you. Just tell him to go, he will say no, that's the rest of the war for you.
And given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. Alright, Mr. President, option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nut.
Hooker. We got General Hooker. He's not a pimp, but he could be if he wanted to. Pimp Hooker, that sounds lovely. Please become a pimp, Mr. General. That suits you much better, I think.
Nutcase, but a good general. Option 2. His qualifications are his name is Burnside, and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns.
Burnside! With these sideburns. Is this a joke? Is this war a meme? Did these generals figure, okay, I'm gonna be called Hooker, I'm gonna be called Sideburns. Or maybe because his name was Sideburn, he decided to grow these huge ass sideburns. It would have been funny if the General Sideburn would have grown a goatee and not a sideburns. That would be so wrong. But this is meme worthy here, like American Civil War. These dudes knew how to be funny 100 or 200 years later, right? They thought about our generation laughing about this. That's why they did these decisions, to grow sideburns or to be a pimp hooker.
Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south. Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey God, whose side are you on? Ow.
Deus vult, my friends, Deus vult.
Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of
100,000 men? See that? And if that's what I was talking in the last video, if they use Napoleon tactics, you do have 100,000 men on a row beside a river, crossing the river, which is just basically what Stalingrad looked like. Machine guns gunning down hundreds of thousands of Russian peasants on the river. This is basically American Stalingrad.
December, but by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces.
It's exactly like Stalingrad. Look at even using the boats and like that. If they would have machine guns on the other side, it would be exactly like Stalingrad.
During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught. Even the Confederates couldn't believe what they were seeing.
Why?
And in one moment of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still.
Okay, this is wholesome that this stuff happened, that they hold their fire, but why? You got an enemy line, you figured, what should I do? I figure I should send all of my men to die like animals without any heavy casualties to the enemy, because I don't really like my men, I don't really like my army, I just send them to die, right? That's a good plan. We will win the war like that. Is this how they thought? I'm 23, I don't have a military education and I would never do this, and they all did have a military education. Yeah, I know a lot of you will comment that, oh, they studied this in the college. Back then the education was Napoleon tactics, that's all they know. But still, you should use your own brain, right? You can see that it doesn't work, even if that's all you know.
Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln.
I mean, it's good of a reason, I guess. You're deserting because you want to get back to your country, right? You're not in your own homeland right now.
Ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my. Here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence. Or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep...
I love it! Yes, carry on, Mr. Lincoln. But yeah, he's a good man with a good heart, because death sentence, if you're like 17, 18, 19, you don't want to fight a war, you have a whole life ahead of you, and you get sentenced to death by your own country and your own government, because you're not just ready for life like that, you're not just ready for the war yet, and you wanted to go home. It's just... I know it's necessary to fight for your homeland, but sometimes you cannot kill men if they don't come. It's a touchy subject, I know. If Estonia would be attacked and we had deserters, we would not have anybody to defend us because there's so little of us. We cannot allow deserters. And then you need to be harsh with them, but still, knowing that even in the winter war in Finland, the Finnish executed their own men for treason or for deserting. It's painful to see. Watch Tuntematon sotilas, The Unknown Soldier. It's the best war movie ever made. It's made by Finland. It's really damn good, and you can actually see that they did execute 2 people there.
The numbers up. Both sides had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the north, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City, with enraged mobs furious at the idea of going to fight for slaves, an idea that many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist. And these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up.
Oh yeah.
By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and...
Wait, 10% was 200,000, which is like then 2 million was the whole army. That's a pretty big number, yeah. But I would guess they would get more blacks, like close to 1 million or something. 200,000 wouldn't be the number I would expect. Most of the black men would go to free their brothers and sisters from slavery.
Bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fellow. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into 2. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece.
How? Who is this Lee guy? Why you gotta be so genius? You have half the men and you win. Lee, Mr. Lee, is in military heaven right now. He's a goddamn genius.
Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire.
Stonewall Jackson was killed by his own men. I guess it wasn't hard as stone after all. Your own row of men, your own stone wall kills you.
You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. it was yet another loss, and Northern support continued to waver. While the Union kept on struggling in the east, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies.
He's genius. I wanna see Grant versus Lee. Look at this. His tactics are what I would use. Feint, over-maneuvering, not direct. Definitely not direct. Going around, feinting attacks, feinting retreats. This guy knows what he's doing. He's ahead of his time, as is Lee. I mean, I know Battle of Gettysburg, Lee just attacked straight forward in the center, which was stupid. But everything else, on point. If both of these generals would never use full-out head-on attack, they would be undefeatable, I think.
Armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything in the world, but the creative minds at the time...
Canada 2, Florida, Mississippi, left Virginia. Oh my god, this Vandalia, these are wonderful names. I wish they would have named it Mississippi. That would be so funny. Because Mississippi is already it's a weird damn name. I guess it's a native language, but still it's a weird name.
Came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack.
Snapping Turtle McGee versus Lee, it's perfect for rap battles of history. There's so many rhymes here.
So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling. Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got. And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out...
That is like a deep thrust into North. Look at this, like it's the furthest they have gotten, I guess. And exactly, Lee makes plans and he follows through with them, like exactly how he planned it. If the North generals before made plans, they just failed because they had Lee against them, you know, they couldn't. But Lee is a man who does it, what he thinks, who does it.
To meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, DC could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point as the Confederates would run out of steam. And the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, we're getting to Gettysburg.
Units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. Joseph, what are you doing? I'm not gonna let them take my beans. How many times do I have to tell you? They're not here for your beans. By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left. But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge.
Okay, I remember this part from the previous video. It was crazy, like 3-4 charges came from the Confederates against him. He ran out of bullets and then he said fix bayonets, he charged back without any bullets and downhill he charged, sent the Confederates running with their backs to the enemy. Crazy surprise moment, and it proved how important the surprisal moments and battlefield tactics, even gunpowder and firepower, or the number of men do not matter if you are aggressive and you have the surprisal moment and your morale is high. I love this moment.
Smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time, it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his...
See, that was the mistake I'm always talking about. Don't go head on, feint retreats, hit and runs, surprise attacks, but this is the stupidest move, to go straight head on. I don't even imagine in the Napoleon times this working. Even in the Napoleon times when it was supposed to work, if you go head on with the enemy, you're just doing that. A lot of pain happens. Why won't anybody use these small skirmish tactics to wear the enemy out, hit and runs and feints, and why head on? Like, I am not going to understand it the rest of my life.
Fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga, and ended up under a Confederate siege at
Chickamauga. I gotta talk about these names in America. Like, they forced native culture out of most of the lands, but the names are quite native. The street names in some cities, in LA even, there was a lot of street names that obviously came from the native names. And Chattanooga is definitely a native name, right? But I bet there's no natives living here anymore.
Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee.
I bet these moments are like the First World War Christmas truce, where men just played football and didn't shoot each other all the time.
The Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the...
Every time you mention Hooker, I'm just... His name is funny. It's funny nowadays. I don't know if it meant the same thing back in the day. I'm sure it didn't. Otherwise, like, it's the same as General Hoare. Yeah, we have a General Hoare. He's really good at war. General Hoare. It rhymes also. Come on, epic rap battles of history, do it.
Mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses. For those who had given their lives, a new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in America.
Wait. I now remember, like 6 years ago, reading this, I just remembered Epic Rap Battles of History did Lincoln versus, who was the other guy? I don't remember who was the other guy, but Lincoln was one. It was like 65 years in the past. I won a civil war with my fist, and I'm here to whoop your ass, something like that. Yeah, they did a video about Lincoln, but I don't remember who was the other guy.
In history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East.
It was Chuck Norris. Lincoln versus Chuck Norris, just remembered it.
And that was bad news for Lincoln, because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily.
Look at the picture, Yeah.
They believed their last shot at victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking. But oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East?
Why not?
Guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was
No, don't stop, please. Lincoln, I love your puns. Carry on.
And he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan...
This is some Operation Barbarossa plan right here, like advancing at all sides of the front and really quickly.
...went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederates.
Yes!
Lincoln.
This is the War of the Titans, Lee versus Grant. I mean, we knew the history is going to win, but these masterminds playing chess against each other in the battlefield, they read each other's minds and all of that.
Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new he did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing.
Oh, look at these casualties. Yeah, it's very costly for the Union, but Grant knew that he has these resources. Like, it's like Stalin in a way. He knew that he had resources. He could just send men to die, and because of this, he won, but with a big, huge price. And this is the same situation almost.
In DC, Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital.
Yes, Grant, this is what I'm talking about. Instead of moving directly, everything I mentioned, he doesn't go directly. It's the stupidest thing. I mean, he has done it till now, like 5 times, and lost a lot of men, but now he's not doing it at the final battle. Smart.
And cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten DC, with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back.
Oh no, not
That's
this
right.
guy. No,
General
no.
George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln.
This, how is even allowed? It's the same as nowadays, like 2 clowns. You have Trump and you have Clinton. I mean, not 2 clowns, but still. Back then, Lincoln is good, but McClellan is a lot like Trump, I would feel like.
Lincoln, my fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war. Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide.
That's what I'm talking
with the
about.
troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose. I merely failed to win.
No.
In January,
The guy lost. Go and, I don't know, do something bad to yourself, please, McClellan.
Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men...
Wait, what does it mean, narrow vote? Narrow and historic. Narrow means it's equal, like it barely passed, or it passed in a landslide, like, oh yeah, it's easy, we voted out loud. Or was it like most of the people wanted it, but a lot of the people didn't want it? What does it mean?
Men and women watching the vote from the galleries knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized...
Yeah, sorry, out of the topic again. Somebody, look at his nose and his ears are really big and his cheekbones. Somebody told me he had like a disease or a syndrome that his facial features would just grow abnormally large. And yeah, he does have these features. I wouldn't say he's ugly, but he's just very prominent, with a very prominent and aggressive face. So this is why the ears are so big and stuff.
the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification. John Wilkes Booth, an actor living in D.C., was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept, that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses.
It is true, it's very true. It is unusually modern, actually, by those standards.
Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up...
I mean, it's almost like scorched earth tactics. You just destroy and eat and burn everything. It's very good for the civilian lives, and I wouldn't do it for my own people. Like, in the end, they are all Americans, but I guess they needed a quick victory. So to make omelette, you gotta break some eggs, or whatever you Americans say about this.
Up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days.
292 days! Siege of Petersburg. Same as Siege of Petersburg when the Nazis sieged it. It was called Leningrad back then, and it lasted also like over a year, I think. Many years. And people starved and ate themselves. People began to turn to cannibalism in that city. And we have Petersburg in America and, Petersburg in Russia. The sieges are quite similar. It's a funny coincidence.
Thousands of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed. But when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burned out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir, listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family.
And they had a breakdance battle and a rap battle. Yes, please tell me it was like that.
By a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now! I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a speech from the...
Wait, but if Lee surrendered, but he was not the president. Jefferson was the president, right? If Lee surrendered and Jefferson wouldn't surrender, I guess the men were loyal to Lee, so if he says he surrenders, then they will listen to him, right?
White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him. He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, I think I am the tiredest man on earth. I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise. The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son.
It's so sad, but I have to say, this is the time of his death, I guess, and this guy is being like a model over here. Look at this dude. He's like, he doesn't even care, he's sitting like that. Oh, I'm classy as hell next to the dead president. I'm sorry, it's a bad time for a joke, but still. Who is this dude sitting here like that? Lincoln is dead. Have some class, my friend. He's having too much class, I guess.
And members of cabinet. At 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion.
So it was a military occupation, but when did they become one great country? Like, till now, the civilian population is still very divided, right? Like, they feel like they're occupied, not part of America, United States. They feel like they have been occupied. So when did this shift happen?
And a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in US history. But the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
I'm beginning to understand more about America as I watch these videos. I understand where it comes from, what's its history, and it doesn't seem so funny to me anymore. And people nowadays talk about the founding fathers and all of that. Look, the founding fathers have become a meme, you know, because all they said, all they actually did. But now I understand a bit more where it all came from and what kind of blood it has come through. So everything that is going on in the US now, it has long roots and a lot of bloody history. So these decisions are not just, there's like some things in America, I think, like, why are they like that? Why is it so stupid that they do things like that? It doesn't make sense to me. But watching these videos about the history, I actually see that where they come from, I understand them a little bit more. Some of the things are still unnecessary and a bit stupid, but still I understand them more. These two videos are very good. Even if they're not as accurate for history, you know, some of you say that Oversimplified just makes more fun than history. I still, as a foreigner, I wouldn't learn American history any other way. I wouldn't learn it. So better I learn it this way. I know, at least I know stuff, you know. So it is a very fun way to educate yourself, I guess. My friends, thank you for watching. Please go and get the cup. It is right here. 5 people got it in the last night. Very lucky people. They have this cool cup. Go and get it also. You'll be lifted in the status of the Greek pantheon gods if you do it. And as always, my friends, until my next video, stay cool and bye bye.